So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are, and welcome to our webinar, Water Leadership, How to Manage Water Risks Beyond the Fence Line. My name is Fatu Samate and I'm a product manager at Southpool Group, and I'll be guiding you through today's session. So for those of you who are not familiar with who we are a leading global sustainability solutions provider, and we have operations spanning 6 continents, as you can see on the map here. We have over 10 years of experience of working with governments and companies around the world to develop and implement climate action measures. To date, we have developed over 400 carbon offset and renewable energy projects, and we've also developed a solid supply chain offering for managing natural capital. So in terms of the objectives for today's webinar, we will provide you with an overview of why investors care about water and how they are expecting you to respond, how you can take action beyond the fence line, and what suitable interventions and solutions are available on the market. We'll also talk about the main barriers to taking action beyond the fence line and how you can overcome these barriers. And finally, how you can measure the environmental and economic benefits of taking action beyond the fence line. We'd also like to hear your thoughts on the various topics that we will be discussing in the webinar, and would encourage you to get involved by submitting your questions through the question panel. And the selection of these questions will then be answered in the Q&A session, which will take place at the end of the presentation. In addition, we'd also kindly ask you to participate in the polls that we will be conducting before the Q&A session. Keep in mind that participation in these polls is voluntary, and the data that we will gather will be used in the development of new corporate water management solutions. I would also like to bring your attention to the fact that today's slides are available in the section called Handouts in your panel. So moving on to today's speakers, we are pleased to have Kate Lamb with us today, who is the head of water at CDP, Alexandra Frank, who is the water lead consultant for the Americas at Southpool Group, Agnese Bocalon, a water management expert at Deltares, and Dominique Buchy, senior manager environment at LafargeHolcim. I will now hand over to Kate Lamb, who will give us an overview of why investors care about water risks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fatu, and good afternoon and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining the presentation. I'll take the next 10 minutes to give you a little bit of an insight around the evolution of investor expectations on water for many of the portfolio companies that are no doubt joining the call today. For those of you that are not familiar with CDP's work, we're an international not-for-profit organisation working using the power of disclosure to change the way the world does business. We have 3 efforts underway. One is to prevent dangerous climate change, one is to prevent the destruction of forests, and the third, which I'm very proudly the head of, is to improve water security globally. We very much view business and investors as part of the solution and work to support them in the efforts that they're taking to ensure that they're more meaningful and deliver the results that we're ultimately all after. So I'm going to change slides now. Forgive me, I had slight problems with this morning. Wonderful. Okay, so it's safe to say that investor interest in water is rising at a global scale. This is demonstrated simply by the current number of CDP signatories that we have working with us. When the program first began, our water disclosure program, this was in 2010, the program operated on behalf of roughly 150 institutional investors with around about $16 trillion worth of assets. That is still a lot of assets, admittedly. However, you can see from the graph in front of you that today the number has risen steadily over the years, and in fact, it's more than quadrupled since that time. This year, the water questionnaire was issued on behalf of 643 institutional investors with around $67 trillion worth of assets. And we can attribute this rise in awareness and this increasing investor interest, I think, down to the fact that many water risks, or certainly the water challenge in general, is becoming much more obvious and immediate in institutional investors' eyes. As a result, we established our water program to help these stakeholders better understand the answer to this, what on the face of it appears to be a relatively simple question. Basically, how resilient is a business in the face of worsening water challenges? The questionnaire that we provide, the scoring methodology that we apply across every response, and of course the many webinars, guidance, documents, and workshops that we host aim to support responding companies in answering the questions and providing the insights needed, and of course taking the actions necessary to ultimately enhance business resilience. So a few key stats from 2015, because this is what CDP does best often. In 2015, we invited 2,400 heavily water dependent companies to disclose business critical information to investors via our single standardized platform. As you can imagine, there's a huge efficiency to be gained there, because companies have to disclose once, and this information is then shared with a large number of individual actors. Of those 2,400 companies, 1,158 responded in total, and these companies came from a range of sectors, including those listed on the right-hand side, although it must be noted that that doesn't represent a complete view of all of the sectors targeted, but it is safe to say that we do target only those where water may pose a substantive threat or indeed opportunity. The companies also came from a whole range of financial markets, including the US, Latin America, Europe, China, India, and South Africa. Analysis of this data indicates that water really is a business issue now, which again validates the investor concerns. The data demonstrates that water is having more rapid and unavoidable consequences for some businesses than even carbon and climate issues. 68% of companies reported exposure to risks that would likely generate a substantive change in their business operations or revenue. At the same time, 65% of these risks are anticipated to impact either now or in the next 3 years. Of those risks, 22% of those respondents reporting exposure reported that these issues, water-related issues, will constrain their growth in the next 3 years. No laughing matter, I'm sure you can agree. So, as we mentioned earlier, investors are increasingly concerned, and here's a slide of just some of those concerns that they're having at the moment. Worsening water security, as demonstrated by our analysis, is constraining growth and posing a license to operate concerns for investors. We already have cases of significant assets being stranded and becoming inoperable because of the loss of license to operate. Companies and their suppliers are already facing disruptions in their business due to water challenges. This can often be a direct operational disruptions, but also supply chain disruptions. And some of you may be already experiencing these in your own businesses. Increasing number of companies are finding themselves in conflict or in competition with local communities and regulators over access to water. And as water security is set to worsen, unfortunately, in many regions, regulators are responding by tightening regulations around the accessibility of water, particularly for industrial water users, posing again a threat potentially to those companies unprepared to respond to those regulations. The risks are therefore imminent and action is needed. And it's this action agenda that the investors are particularly interested in particular. They understand that the world is a risky place. What they want to make sure is that you understand those risks and are taking action to mitigate them. Here's an example of Unilever, of how water scarcity in particular is evaporating the growth for Unilever. the company disclosed last year that the growth of their products in certain regions, particularly emerging economies such as India, where worsening water security is increasing, um, the sales of their products, which can typically account for over 90% of domestic water use, may be constrained because the consumers in those countries are having to make difficult decisions about which, or trade-offs about which household tasks will get their scarce ration of water. So where once these emerging markets were viewed as a substantial area for growth, where a burgeoning middle class would be taking at least 2 showers a day, if not more, where they would be everybody would have a washing machine in their home and be undertaking much more laundry, this is no longer the case. And so Unilever is adapting its products and services so that it can adapt and respond to this changing market condition and ensure that it remains competitive. They're able to do that because, of course, they identified the problem in the first place. And this is what investors are expecting companies to do ultimately at this point, is to develop a deeper understanding of the risks that you may be facing. And when they have the data that is disclosed by you through CDP, they're using it a whole range of ways. And it presents a few opportunities or a few areas in which both CDP's water and climate change data has been used over the last year or so. We see it's used by research providers to inform the asset managers within specific firms of the threats facing companies that they may be investing in. It's used by the sell side to make broker recommendations. For example, just last year we wrote a report with Morgan Stanley on the metals and mining sector, which made specific recommendations on which stocks to pursue and which ones to not pursue because of water-related challenges. It's used by the buy side of the finance community to inform their engagement activities. And we've seen many of you who are based in the US may be aware that just last year, a group of investors managing around $2.6 trillion worth of assets sent letters to 15 US food companies that had poor water disclosure. The sole request of that letter was to essentially come clean on water risks and disclose to CDP. That was coordinated by Ceres, and we anticipate more of those types of interventions to happen. We certainly know for this year, we had an increasing number of European investors undertaking the same activity. Here's a quote from the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. This is a wonderful faith-based coalition of investors in the US managing roughly $3.74 trillion worth of assets. And they state that they use our data to understand companies' water-related risk exposure and water stewardship opportunities. Importantly, this is my final slide, investor expectations with regards to how you should be responding to this is maturing and is becoming recognizing the complexity of water, and that a response on water stewardship and water risk is not the same as a response for carbon. They still feel very strongly that disclosure is lacking at a time when demand for data is growing. And we certainly hope to see an increase in disclosure to CDP and to our water program this year. In fact, there's just 2 weeks to go before companies can submit their final response. So if you haven't started already, I would advise you to do so. We're here to help. As I mentioned a moment ago, the awareness of water risks the awareness of the fact that many of these water risks that companies are facing are often driven by factors beyond the direct control of most companies is also rising within the finance community. And as a result, more investors are expecting the companies to take actions in order to mitigate risks that should ultimately be informed by the context within which a company operates and may likely often incorporate beyond the fence line activities. This is, of course, the subject of the event today, and I'll now hand over to my colleague who can share more information about these types of actions and how you can progress. I very much look forward to hearing any further questions you may have in the chat over the period of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for sharing these insights with us, and also for setting the scene for the next section of this presentation, which will be presented by Alexandra Frank, and she will talk about the growing trends in corporate responses to water risks and the case of Lake Naivasha. Alexandra?
Thank you very much, Fatou, and hello everyone from my side as well. To provide you with a brief background on today's webinar, I'm trying to move the slide, which is not working. As a brief background, South Pole Group, CDP, and Deltares, we are all in a project that is called Water Action, and it is co-financed by the European Union, where we analyze the trends of external action. And by external action, we mean that companies engage other stakeholders within the watershed that they operate, and also work with ecosystems around them to manage their water risks. So we not only analyze these trends, but we also investigate in what kind of services are needed to facilitate this external action. So therefore, as you have been pre-warned, we would really like to ask for your opinion towards the end of this webinar in some poll questions. Moving to the next slide. Where does external action fit into within the corporate water stewardship journey? A corporate water steward with the awareness step, he starts to understand the impacts that are caused by its operations and identifies and analyzes water risks. And in the management step, as the name says, the corporate starts to manage the impacts and risks, for instance, with an internal water strategy, integrating the results of the risk analysis into the business and growth strategies, and at this stage, starting to take internal action. So taking action that, for instance, reduces the water intensity of the business or reduces the pollution of its processes. And then in the leadership step, this is where external action comes in, where the company starts to engage other stakeholders, and with the action to reduce risks, to reduce water risks, simultaneously he creates value for the ecosystems and the people in the wider catchment. So ideally, a corporate water steward not only understands and addresses the risks in its own operation, as you can see in the line below, but also addresses suppliers and engages customers. And moving to the next slide, what does that actually mean for companies to have too much, too little, too dirty water for production? So we analyzed 100 companies that responded to the water program that Kate has explained upon before. And you can see that over 90% of the industries in the beverage and apparel, and also up to 90% in the food products industry, they are exposed to substantive water risks. And already in 2014, many of them faced water-related impact that actually led to the closure of operations, to higher operational costs. And what are these water risks? Of course, they depend on the reliance on water for operations, on the value chains used, or on the brand profile. But we see a tendency that most often these companies report physical risk drivers, like water scarcity, water flooding, and quality. And moving to the next slide, how can companies address these risks? So we analyzed these 100 companies and their 300 incidents that they reported, and we divided them into a scheme that differentiates between internal and external action. Internal action addresses water resources that are typically under the direct control of the company, and the actions address like water intensity, they set up emergency plans, they reduce the pollution, so typically within their own operations these actions are taken. While external action addresses water resources that are not under the exclusive control of these companies, but really they start to engage with other uses in the catchment. One example would be a restoration of a wetland upstream or downstream. And why is extraction becoming more important? The water pollution, poor governance, or inadequate public infrastructure. This is not only a risk that affects one single company, but no water means reduced production for the company and for local farmers. It means damaged habitat and ecosystem. It means also health problem for local communities. So the impact is really felt at the local basin. And therefore, IUCN, WWF, many institutions believe that successful risk management should be based on solutions that also work for the local water users. So how did these companies react? How do they manage their risks? What are the trends? We see that in more than half of the responses, companies applied a strategy that entailed an external action component. And that's pretty interesting. While 5 years ago, water footprint assessments were the paradigm of corporate water stewardship, now companies start to realize we need to engage the basin. And when and where does external action take place? So usually it's in response to a complex risk combination, not only to physical risks like too much, too little, or bad quality water, but also in combination with reputational or regulatory risks. So in addition to facing water scarcity for operations, the company might also be perceived as a big water consumer in the catchment, or faces stricter abstraction permits, and therefore starts to address these risks with an external action component. External action leaders are the food and the beverage and the mining industry, and in terms of hotspots, it happens more often in the global south. And what are these kind of typical actions? Many external actions, as it is in the definition of us, engage with stakeholders, meaning they set up roundtables, they set up public dialogue platforms, or they start to invest in natural water infrastructure. So for instance, in an upstream forest to control sedimentation, nutrients, and the flow of water. And they engage into climate smart agriculture, invest in public infrastructure, or they provide surrounding communities with access to water and sanitation facilities. And when we look at the costs of these water response strategies, on average, we see that companies that apply both an internal and an external component within one strategy, they seem to take it very seriously. They dedicate, on average, $10 million for each strategy. This is it for the analysis for now, but please be aware that we will also publish a white paper on this kind of background analysis on external action. So now we've seen the trends, the global trends, and how does local reality look like? Let's take the case of Lake Naivasha, where 70% of the Kenyan exported flowers are cultivated and produced. And one of our corporate clients, Coop, sources its flowers from there. And as the risks and also the responses are very specific to each basin, here the issue is that there are many large water abstractors around the lake, like big flower farms and geothermal. And due to incorrect land use on the slopes upstream, or due to deforestation, as you can see in the two pictures below, or due to a badly working sewage system, the catchment, the river basin really faces bad water quality issues. And what does that mean for our corporate? He faces supply chain disruption risks as well as reputational risks. And so South Pole started to analyze the key stakeholders in the catchment. We consulted the local river basin management plans, and reforestation of the watershed is seen as a major and well-working solution for the water-related conditions. And therefore, we convene the most important actors, the international supply chain, large-scale downstream farms, small-scale upstream farmers, as you can see in the picture above, the two honey cultivators, and the Kenyan Forestry Service, the River Basin Management Authorities, and the NGOs like WWF, who are already very strong in this catchment, and to integrate them all in this collective action approach of reforesting this watershed. And of course, as every actor has different incentives, we are setting up different financing mechanisms as well as a monitoring system to keep track and ensure this reforestation benefits for our corporates. He not only reduces his own water risks within the supply chain, but also the wider catchment can benefit from reduced sedimentation and controlled water flows. And in addition, for instance, the smallholder farmers, they can not only sell the timber products that they generate from the growth from the trees, but they can also sell like fruits and non-timber products. And lastly, the corporate even thinks about creating carbon credits to compensate for emissions on products that are imported by air. And the nice thing about this approach is that we can link it to other European retailers and also to other local stakeholders. So thank you very much. That was it from me. And now Agnese will present a big range of other external action measures.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Alexandra. As Alexandra mentioned in the slide, I will present a bit more in detail what we have done within the Water Action Project. Before that, for those of you that are not familiar with Deltares, just a brief introduction. We are a applied research institute focusing on soil and on water and subsurface resources. We are based in the Netherlands with 7 regional offices worldwide in the US, Ecuador, Australia, Singapore, Indonesia, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. And we work across 5 main research lines. Those are the ones that you can see on the left side of the slide. We do provide advice on flood risk management, availability of freshwater resources and soil resources. We provide advice on sustainable delta infrastructure, such as offshore engineering, waterways and similar structures, and we provide advice on healthy ecosystems, water quality and soil quality. We do this in an integrated way, which means that we combine both technical expertise and socio-economic expertise, and that results, for example, in our extensive work in providing advice on sustainable delta planning for large deltas of the world. Moving to the next slide, I will present you with the approach that we use within the Water Stewardship in Action project. And we mainly started from a risk identification phase for companies. And in this phase, we look at the value chains of the 5 industries we analyze: tobacco, apparel, food, beverage, and mining. And within the value chain, we identified the components where water use was or is more intensive, and both from a supply side and from a use side. After this identification phase, we look at what were the main physical water risks faced by the companies working in these sectors, which directly link also to reputational and regulatory risk. And based on the findings, we come up with an inventory of measures that could better respond to the faced challenges. These measures, we grouped them in 4 clusters, which I will explain in the next slide. And the first step is we look into the implementation scale of these measures within the watershed, which means that some measures are best to be implemented at the wider scale, basin or subcatchment scale. Some others measures at the field level, and more technical measures are suited to be applied as a point source measures. The 4 clusters we identified, which you can see in this slide, they are based on different, let's say, natural or physical infrastructure. The first cluster, natural water infrastructure, embraces all those measures that rely on natural capital, such as forests, mangroves, wetlands, or peatlands. The second category of solutions we identified refers to more structural interventions related to infrastructure, and we are talking here, for example, about check dams, water supply and sanitation improvement, measures for groundwater treatment, such as permeable reactive barriers, or more, let's say, extensive measures such as the upgrade of public water supply. On the other hand, we also have solutions that are more technology-based, and where the, let's say, risk mitigation comes from the application of the technology. And some examples are water buffering or wastewater reuse for aquifer recharge. And lastly, we look at solutions that could specifically be applied to the agricultural sector. As you can see from the different coloring, some measures, they have characteristics that belong to different clusters, so they have, let's say, multiple functions. What we did with these 14 measures that we identified, we look at 3 dimensions. The first dimension we analyzed has been the time dimension. Here we ask ourselves, once a company has decided to take action in mitigating the risk faced in its supply chain, how long does it take to actually implement the selected measure, and how long does it take for the measure to deliver its benefits? In the table on this slide, you S, M, and L, they stand for short, medium, and long term, where short term indicates a period below 1 year, medium between 1 and 4 years, and long periods above 5 years time. As you can see, implementation time for most of the measures is within the range of 1 and 4 years, whereas the benefits payback time often occurs in the medium term. The message here is that, of course, the earlier action is taken by companies in mitigating the risks in its production lines, the lower are the business losses that the company faces, because the more options are available for intervention. The second dimension we looked at is the evaluation of impact produced by these measures. And for each of the 13 measures, we look at indicators that could provide information on physical impact. This means that for each of the 3 physical water risks identified, water scarcity, water quality, and flooding, we evaluated how powerful that measure is in decreasing or in improving local conditions in terms of water availability, decrease of water pollution, or reduction in annual runoff for flooding, for example. We also took into account other indicators, namely implementation indicators, looking at, for example, how much is the average required capital investment to implement measures, or how much that measure, the implementation of that measures depend on other external factors, such as, for example, availability of input materials. Lastly, we also evaluate the measures in terms of their performance, looking at the reliability of that measure in delivering the results. So, for example, the number of times the measure does not succeed in delivering the expected results, the resilience of that measure in terms of, for example, different climate conditions, and cost-benefit ratio. Looking more at the financial aspects, and this is our third dimension we analyzed. We took into account the requirements in terms of initial investment into the measures and operation and maintenance costs. As you can see from the graphs, initial investment, it takes the largest share of the required capital investment for companies, but still operation and maintenance costs, they need to be taken into account because they represent required let's say finance disbursement in the medium to long term. And operation and maintenance costs are those that let's say ensure that the measure is able to deliver the results at the throughout its lifetime. Some other outcome from our research is that despite these figures, which might seem high but are actually not high, the beyond the fence measures costs are lower as compared to the option of non-intervention, which for companies might indeed create high reputational and regulatory risk affecting their production lines. My last slide shows a tool. Well, the outline of a simple decision support tool that in this case, for example, is showing the process through which a company, once, for example, it has identified water scarcity as its main physical risk across the value chain, how this company can select a number of measures based on three main criteria, and these criteria are the climate conditions on which the company operates, the degree of urgency faced by the company in mitigating the risk, and the desired intervention scale. My conclusion here is that the earlier action is taken on decreasing the physical risk, the more options are available for companies. Moreover, we found out that same solution can provide, same measures can provide solutions for multiple hazards, and that collective action, therefore joining your forces together with other companies operating in the same watershed, lead to larger impact and lower investment costs for the company. That's to conclude on my presentation, and I will be happy to answer any question that you might have in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnese. It's great to see that there are some practical solutions available on the market for companies that are ready to take action. And one company that has done so already is LafargeHolcim. Dominic Buchy will explain how his company has benefited from adopting an external action approach.
Hello to everyone, and thank you for setting the scene on the topic here. I would like to briefly introduce you to LafargeHolcim's water stewardship approach and to the external action program we have defined. So we have recently launched our 2030 plan, which is our new sustainable development strategy, the long-term strategy. And there we are combining strategic targets and divide them in actions to be developed in-house compared to different activities that go beyond the fence. And when we look at the pillar on water and nature, we'll see that we have targets looking at operational efficiency, like freshwater withdrawal reduction, or also implementation of the WBCSD wash pledge, which is definitely looking at our operating sites. However, then lower down in the red circle, you can also see that we have set the objective to make a positive impact in water scarce areas where we operate and in developing different activities beyond the fence. So what is very important, I think, here to be stressed is that activities always start with in-house measures, so water efficiency projects are very key. I think this is very important also for being taken serious by external stakeholders, that they see that we also care about that same issue within our operation. But obviously I want to concentrate on the activities beyond the fence in this presentation. The overall objective of being water positive was derived from experience that was collected by one of our group companies in India, which is definitely within the LafargeHolcim group a front runner in terms of developing beyond the fence activities and community water projects. And so they have started to work on this some years back already and have formulated and also achieved the target to be water positive and get that also externally certified for the Indian in the Indian context. Now, just briefly on our 2030 plan. So basically what we want to show there is to further improve operational eco-efficiency, but also to be part of the solution of different problems and challenges that we are facing these days, and that will definitely also keep to be a challenge going further. So the plan looks at on one hand side at quantitative targets and looks at direct and indirect impacts, but it also looks at different efforts on the sustainability performance in our operations, where we want to develop innovative and sustainable solutions related to buildings and infrastructure. And as well, we want to go beyond our own business activities. So this is where we find the beyond the fence activities, where we also would then think and act towards engaging our stakeholders. And this is an important component here to understand these type of water projects. So we have defined three main categories of sustainable water projects that we want to develop within the group. And you can see that there is one category there on watershed protection and restoration, where it is about recharging natural water resources to protect or construct wetlands. Also to work on reforestation projects, and this is directly linked with the different quarrying activities we have, where often there are major retention potentials available in quarries, or also in areas that have been rehabilitated, where we can make use again of these areas for reforestation. The second category is around water access and sanitation, so providing water to local communities and also helping them to develop sanitation solutions, so always in a local context. Then the third category is water for productive use, which is related mainly to agricultural activities, where treated wastewater can be reused for irrigation purposes, or where we treat the water towards this, and as well different activities around rainwater harvesting. So I mean, that obviously leaves a lot of different possibilities for local projects to be developed and to be selected according to the local circumstances, also according to local stakeholders' needs and priorities. So looking at a few key elements of the water positive impact methodology, which is applicable in sites in water scarce areas. So obviously we had to define what is a water scarce area first, looking at different criteria, different tools to be used. And there we decided to go for a mixed approach, looking at annual renewable water supply and as well the annual relative water stress index, in order to focus our activities on these, let's say, most critical sites. Then under the water impact categories, we have define different criteria and indicators to measure the impact of our operations, because basically we want to compensate for the water that is being consumed in our operations. So we need to know where we start, what the baseline is, and then obviously also to measure and to define how much water has been, let's say, recharged to natural water resources, or how much water has been made available for farming, or how much water has been saved through more efficient farming technologies. What is the volume of water that was made available for sanitation and hygiene purposes? So the calculation methodologies defined will compare and take into consideration all these different efforts, and at the end the water positivity approach compares how much water has been used versus how much water is being credited through the different activities of the project. In terms of benefits of this water positive impact approach, obviously there have been there are all sorts of different benefits here, but it's clear that these projects also help to mitigate a business risk. We have had operations that were forced to shut down due to water shortage, and obviously there the impact is quite severe. But also we have seen that due to good water management practices in several operations, even due to a general shortage or a drought situation, we're still able to continue operation. So this is definitely a very important aspect. And of course that links directly as well into reputational risks, because if we are seen to be one of the major water consumers in the river basin where there is shortage or drought conditions, then obviously this impacts our reputation. Then what is very clear, I mean, business is one side, but obviously there also must be different other benefits related to these projects, because they are developed in collaboration and in the context of local communities. So all these benefits are quite significant as well, and there have been benefits like increased food security, also a better availability and an improved accessibility to water and sanitation in some cases as well, due to the increased availability of water for agricultural purposes. There were 2 crops possible after some of the projects compared to 1 single crop in a year before. So there are definitely a whole series of different benefits, and often it's of course a combination of different benefits. Okay, now moving to some of the key considerations. What is, of course, a bit of a limiting element in our methodology is that water positivity is expressed purely on volumes. But not all the water management activities and the related impacts and benefits can as well be measured in volumes. There are definitely some aspects which go beyond volume considerations, be it in terms of working on educational campaigns, awareness raising. Hopefully also there are some qualitative improvements possible on some of the projects without mentioning as well health improvements. What is very clear is that the local context is an extremely important element there, and all the water issues are always to be seen and to be identified in a local context. And equally as well for the right actions and the related benefits, they can only be defined and monitored understanding the same local context. Yeah, so that's an overview on the program we have been developing at LafargeHolcim. Overall, we are now going into the next phase. We will start to pilot and test that water positive impact methodology with different countries. There's still a lot we have to learn and will be able to learn going through these pilots. And we will also try to build up some experience in order to be able to assist some of our colleagues in local group companies in supporting them to select the relevant projects to combine our experience with their local understanding of the situation they face. So this is it from my side. Thanks a lot, and I'm looking forward to any question if there are any.
Thank you, Dominic, for sharing your water stewardship journey with us and how you've benefited from implementing measures beyond the fence line. I'm sure that you've inspired many of today's participants to start their own water stewardship journey. It is now time to conduct the polls. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the participation in these polls is voluntary. Also considering the nature of these questions, I would kindly ask that only our corporate participants participate in these polls. Again, the data that will be gathered here will be used to develop new corporate water management solutions. So here is a slide showing the first 3 questions that I will ask. I will now launch the polls. Please answer the questions as they appear on your screen. So the first one is, would investing in external action interest your company? Select yes or no. Thank you for your answers. We'll move on to the second question. Has your company already implemented external action measures? And here again, please select yes or no. Thank you for that. And we'll move on to the third question. How will you budget for implementing external action measures change within the next year? So will it increase, decrease? Will it remain the same? Or perhaps you don't have a budget yet for external action? Thank you for that. Moving on to the fourth question. What are the top 3 risk drivers that you face that could be addressed by external action? And here you can select from physical risks such as droughts, floods, poor quality, or reputational risks or regulatory risks. Thank you once again for providing your answers to these questions. We'll move on to the fifth poll. So what are the top 3 barriers to external action? And here you can select again up to 3 answers. Thank you for that, and we'll move on to the final question. Would you be interested in receiving more information about the outcome of the Climate Kick water project that was described earlier in this presentation? Please select yes or no. And that was the final question. Thank you all for your participation. I would like to open up the floor for questions now. And as I mentioned in the beginning, please enter your questions in the question panel. Our first question is directed to Dominic at LafargeHolcim. The question is, how do you weigh co-benefits of a project to mitigation of business risks if there is a need to choose between project alternatives? Dominic?
Yes. I'm not quite sure I really understand the question. So I think there are 2 questions as well, right?
Yes, there are 2 questions. So CN Cook is also wondering, in the beyond defense actions, including projects that benefit other companies and local stakeholders, do you also look for co-financing of the projects?
Yeah. Okay, I think I understand. Well, if there are different options in how we can address certain risks, it's absolutely key to have a thorough understanding of what the local situation is and what what might be the best approach to address some of those local risks. So what we have done as well at LafargeHolcim, we have developed a risk assessment methodology which takes more aspects into consideration than just a water stress element. So we are looking at what are the regulatory risk, what is the ecological sensitivity, what is the stakeholder relation, and different elements. Also what are internal risks elements and what are external risk elements. And in that situation, I would say then we would really try to understand all the different risk elements of our risk assessment methodologies and there assess what we consider the most promising project in a local context. Now, as well, looking at whether we would or how we would work with other companies or local stakeholders, it's absolutely possible, yes, to have co-financed projects. We have some of our foundations which run basically the corporate social responsibility projects in local companies that are working with different partners and are also being financed through different channels. So they might get some funds from the local LafargeHolcim company, but might also work with other state or government institutions or other project partners. There, obviously, the question is then who claims how much benefit out of these projects, but this would have to be then addressed case by case.
Thank you, Dominic, for addressing Cian Cook's question. Are there any further questions? Now is the time to enter these into the question panel. So it seems like that's it for the Q&A session. We've reached the final step of the presentation, and as always, would love to hear your feedback on today's session. So do not hesitate to get in touch with any of today's participants if you have any further questions. You can find their contact details here. And as mentioned in the beginning, you can download these slides in the handout section. Finally, I'd also like to thank all of our speakers for their contributions, and thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you have gained some clarity in how implementing external action measures can actually be a business opportunity for your company. And we look forward to your participation in future events. Thank you.